introduce today's class, and in particular, today's instructor, Danny Fingereth. Danny is a popular culture critic and historian. His most recent book is called A Marvelous Life, The Amazing Story of Stan Lee. It was published by St. Martin's Press, which is a Macmillan public company. And it's the first biography after the 2018 death of the controversial and pioneering Stan Lee, who was the Jewish creator of Marvel's most famous characters. The book was a Times of London Book of the Year. Great book. A longtime executive editor and a writer at Marvel Comics, where Danny ran the company's Spider-Man products. He is the son of a cantor. He's the author of many other books, including Disguised as Clark Kent, Jews, Comics, and the Creation of the Superhero, which is kind of what today's class will be about. Danny was one of the founders of Brooklyn's Jewish Comic Con, and he was the curator and the moderator of the YIVO Institute Comics and the Jewish American Dream, which is an interview series where he interviewed Julius Pfeiffer, Al Jaffe, Harvey Pekar, other people of that nature. He has spoken on comics-related topics at Columbia University, at the Smithsonian Institute here in Washington, the American Jewish Historical Society, the Sharon Miller Museum of Jewish Art, the Bremen Jewish Heritage Museum, the Limud Conference in England, and many other venues. He's currently at work on books about not comic characters, but iconic 20th century Jewish American figures, Bob Dylan and Jack Ruby, quite different people. So Danny, you can take it over if you will, please.
Okay. Oh, look, it's me.
It's you.
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you, everybody, for coming. A bunch of you I know, many of you I don't. So thanks for taking a chance. And Zoom is, every time somebody knocks on the door, Zoom is telling me my hair doesn't actually look this funny normally, but I have a fake background because you don't want to see my actual apartment. However, this is the background from Doctor Strange's headquarters in the Marvel movies, if you're familiar with that. So I want to thank the Jewish Study Center for inviting me. I want to thank Jerry Garfinkel, even though it's very confusing whether his name is spelled with a G or a J, and I spent many an hour trying to get it just right and then doing it wrong in emails, but it's the thought that counts. I want to thank Mr. Ron Zoni, who arranged this shidduch and put us together and started me in talking to Jerry about doing this event. So, you know, I think I'm going to have a lot of slides. I have a lot to talk about. I was going to read an excerpt from my book, but instead I will just show, if by some miracle we have extra time near the end, I'll read an excerpt from it. But I think, you know, but this is the book that it's called A Marvelous Life, The Amazing Story of Stan Lee. And Stan, and this is the book Disguised as Clark Kent, which is actually harder to get. This is out of print, although I hope to bring it back into print soon. But this was from about 10 years ago or so. And that is my wife's family coming into Ellis Island with their superhero relative. The Stan Lee book is available in paperback and an audio book. So if after this, you haven't had enough of this voice, then imagine 14 hours being piped into your head. So the evening subject is the same as the subject of one of my books, Disguised as Clark Kent, Jews, Comics, and the Creation of the Superhero. The superhero obviously is this incredible media phenomenon now. You know, they've been around since the late 1930s with the beginning of Superman, in comic books and then in other media by extension. movie serials and radio and television and movies. And the bizarre thing, you know, I spent my whole career, professional career, pretty much in the comic book, in and around the comic book business. And most people, probably most of you, you know, although I know there are some of you who this is not true of, know about superheroes from the movies, from TV, from almost anything but comic books. But they still publish comic books. They publish some very hot, a lot of the stuff you may have read when you were a kid has been reprinted many times. There's a whole world of graphic novels. And really a lot of it, most of it started in virtual sweatshops run out of the same garment industry lofts in New York, where you know, where these first and second generation either immigrants or children of immigrants found this comic book business when there were creative writers and artists and people who, for, you know, either for reasons of money or interest or luck, did not go into the traditional Jewish professions. And they found they had this skill, but they couldn't get into the advertising business. They couldn't get into even syndicated comic strips. These were closed in many ways to Jews because of just, you know, the prejudice that existed and still exists, but existed in a very virulent way in this country in the 30s and 40s. And so they, you know, they virtually, it was Jewish publishers and Jewish artists and writers who really in very many ways created the phenomenon of the comic book and more specifically of the superhero. So I am going to now start the screen sharing, and because rather than just listen to me, yeah, I have many slides that will I think you'll find interesting. So I'm going to hit the share screen. Nope, that's not what I do. Wait, nope. I'm going to put, let's see. Yeah, this, you know, no matter how many times I do this. There we go. Okay. I pretend you didn't see all the slides. And okay. All right. So here we go. This is, of course, on the left, there's a rendition. And I wish I knew the identities of either of these painters. I should look this up, but that is a rendition of baby Kal-El being flying from the exploding planet Krypton heading towards Earth. I would not be the first, nor will I be the last to see that the similarities it has to Moses being sent down the Nile and being discovered by Pharaoh's daughter in a small capsule-like crib. And you know, so the Jewish analogies start, but by no means end there. This is, if you were reading comics in the 50s and 60s, this is probably one of the more famous renditions from an issue of Superman where they tell his origin. This is in the early 60s, and the Superman started in 38. So this is a kind of classic Superman origin. You know, many of you, I'm sure, remember Marlon Brando as Jor-El with putting the baby in the capsule in the 1978 Superman movie. This is so the planet, you know, there's a metaphor to be made. There's an argument to be made for the metaphor of Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, who you'll see in a minute, who co-created Superman really as teenagers in Cleveland. And as the exploding toxic kryptonite that the planet turned into being kind of a metaphor for the toxic situation in Eastern Europe, in Germany, in Poland, in Russia, you know, in Hungary, and all, you know, the Eastern European countries, that the Jews were fleeing from. This is, of course, I don't know if all or any of these people are Jewish, but this is sort of the classic image of immigrants coming to America. This is a rendition of the Lower East Side of Manhattan, drawn by a guy named Jack Kirby. You'll be hearing that name a lot because Kirby was instrumental in so many of the characters that you know and that have become so famous from Marvel and from DC. This is his rendition of this, of his boyhood streets of the Lower East Side, and kind of expresses it in a way that that really almost no photo could. So this is Kirby's childhood. We get to Superman is the original superhero, though there are many precursors. But this is, again, something that many of you might find most familiar is George Reeves and as both Superman and Clark Kent from the 50s show. This is Christopher Reeve from the 1978 movie. So Superman is just in our consciousness. This is Henry Cavill, or Cavill, if you will, who plays Superman in the more recent movies, where they sort of have taken more of a Jesus approach to Superman. But the idea is he's someone coming from beyond to rescue people in trouble, specifically Jews in trouble for numerous reasons we can get into. This is from the most recent Superman TV show. It's called Superman and Lois, and it stars Taylor Hoechlin and Elizabeth Tulloch. I'm sure I've butchered their names, but this is kind of, they and Cavill are the Superman and Lois for this era. This is Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. They attended one of what I call the Harvard, Princeton, and Yale of comic book creation. They didn't go to Harvard, Princeton, or Yale. They grew up. They were children of immigrants, and they grew up in the Glenville neighborhood of Cleveland, which they were both born in 1914. So in the 20s and 30s, Glenville was really kind of like the Lower East Side of Cleveland. And they lived in kind of this Jewish bubble, kind of almost like the Bronx or other Jewish neighborhoods in other cities, in a very intensely Jewish city. And they were big science fiction fans. They were kind of, dare I say, nerds. They were not especially popular, but they did have a group of people they corresponded with, many of them Jewish, all over the country, also science fiction fans. So that's Jerry Siegel on top, who really came up with the Superman idea, and his friend Joe Shuster. And they tried to sell this idea for years. This is Glenville High School, where they went to school. It's got a pretty impressive roster of people who went on to great achievements in the arts and sciences and humanities and all sorts of things. This is the house where Superman was created, in Glenville. Cleveland, as you'll see with Harvey Pekar later, and maybe you're from Cleveland, so maybe you know, is very ambivalent about its comic book royalty. So it took years and years and years for a guy named, an author named Brad Meltzer, to just get to raise money to finally put like the Superman insignia on the front of the house and a little plaque. But I mean, it's a house that people live in. I was in Cleveland a few years ago, and I wanted to visit the house, which is now in a black ghetto. And I had a friend who's a journalist, and I said, so how would I get to see the Siegel house where Superman was created? He said, well, go there and ring the bell, and if they're home and in a good mood, they'll let you in. So Cleveland really, needs to, but this is this kind of lower middle class home in what was then a Jewish neighborhood where Jerry and Joe created Superman. This is a pulp magazine called Amazing Stories. The pulps were precursors to the comics. Again, largely published and authored by young Jewish immigrants and children of immigrants. a guy named Hugo Gernsback, who was modest enough and to put his name on the cover, was another Jewish immigrant who kind of invented the terms, like everything I'm going to tell you, by the way, every origin story I tell you about how things were created, there are 10 conflicting origin stories, but I'm going to do my best to piece together a narrative because success has many parents and this history is very complicated. There's a lot of money involved and a lot of egos and fame, but this is the precursor. This is a guy named Max Gaines, born Max Ginsberg. He was he was in publishing. He sold newsprint, and he's generally credited as kind of sort of inventing what we call the comic book now. You know, the myth is that he took Sunday newspaper comics and folded them in 4 and bang, you got a comic book. You know, nothing is that simple. There are many conflicting origins, but this was this immigrant Jewish guy who figured out, you know, what people wanted in entertainment. And this, and a certain, you know, this was Famous Funnies was his early comic, and it was put out as an experiment. It was entirely reprints of comic strip characters, and it turned out to be very popular. But at a certain, and then here's Ginsberg Gaines on the left with his business partners, who were in the middle. That's Harry Donenfeld, and on the right is Jack Leibowitz. They were again, they were actually, I think, children of immigrants, of Eastern European Jewish immigrants, and they were publishing pulps. They were publishing what was then considered pornography. That's the origins of comics. This business that was very lowbrow, very disreputable, literally one step of, I mean, when I say pornography, very, you know, mild and timid compared to what exists today. But for its time, Mayor LaGuardia tried to have them shut down. Mayor LaGuardia fits a lot in the mythology of and history of comics. So these are the people who own the company that would launch this comic book. This is Action Comics #1, and it's of course where the character Superman came from. The company was started by a guy named Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson, who was a visionary and something of a genius, and you can tell by that name, not Jewish, but also kind of not always the world's greatest businessman, and got taken advantage of and ended up. And so his company, including Superman, which again had many, many, many parents and many people claiming to have discovered it. Jerry and Joe invented it in 33. It didn't get published till 38. They had done a lot of work for Nicholson, for Leibowitz and Donenfeld. This is Superman in his earliest incarnation. This is Action Comics #1. This is Superman as Jerry Siegel's ideal of the Roosevelt era, New Deal, progressive superhero. That, you know, I mean, that superheroes have been involved with politics from the beginning, and Superman was involved with having bringing justice to crooked mine owners, bringing justice to domestic abusers, bringing justice to crooked politicians. It was a very New Deal 30s kind of thing. And Jerry and Joe were very aware, as they had to be, of the storm clouds gathering in Europe, of fascism becoming dominant. This is from a special feature that was done for Look magazine, where Superman basically grabs Hitler and Stalin and dictates peace terms to them. Clearly it didn't stick. But it's very interesting that Superman, who was an alien, right? Superman's the first illegal alien, one of the most famous illegal alien. He comes from a faraway planet. Luckily for him, he looks like an Earth human. And he says to Hitler, "I'd like to land a strictly non-Aryan sock on your jaw, but there's no time for that." Put me down, you're hurting me. This was like a real wish fulfillment for Jerry and Joe, these two Jewish kids from Cleveland. Superman was one of the first, not only the first official superhero, although there have been precursors like Zorro and the Phantom, but Superman put together all these different genres and subgenres, and was one of the first to have a cartoon made of his adventures. This is from the Fleischer Brothers cartoons, and yes, you've guessed it, the Fleischer, Max and Dave Fleischer were Jews working first in New York, then in Florida. They did Gulliver's Travels, a lot of interesting stories. The Siegel and Schuster story is not a very pretty one. They had all the success. The original sin, so to speak, if you'll pardon the expression, of comics is the so-called work for hire, that these kids, that these teenagers essentially, who were out earning their fathers at age like 17, 18, 19, did not own these characters. So Siegel and Schuster did very well. They were paid well, but at a certain point, they tried to sue for the rights to Superman, which they famously sold for $130, which even in today's money would still not be a whole lot, considering what Superman spawned. And they were kind of banished from DC Comics, which is the publisher, for a while. And they went out on their own. About 10 years later, they tried to catch lightning in a bottle a second time with a character called Funny Man. Since you've probably never heard of Funny Man, you can gauge how successful they were. It was sort of a lighter hearted look. It was kind of a stand-up comedian superhero, modeled, probably not technically licensed after Danny Kaye. If you can see, if you look at the character shooting the pea shooter at the giant villain, he kind of looks like Danny Kaye. So they fell on hard times. They were not treated well. And it's kind of the thing that every comics creator has tried to avoid. This is the second in the Harvard, Princeton, Yale. This is DeWitt Clinton High School in the Bronx. Some of you may know it, some of you may have gone there. The roster of alumni of DeWitt Clinton is as long as your arm. Includes James Baldwin and Daniel Shore and Dolph Shays, and just it goes on and on and on. It includes a lot of young men. At that point, it was an old boys school. So it includes a lot of young men, including Stan Lee. This is, if you know Stan from his cameos, he's the old guy in all the cameos in the Marvel movies. This is Stan's high school, DeWitt Clinton High School graduation. A little detour. This is where Stan had his bar mitzvah. This is it's a synagogue in Washington Heights, I think on 170th Street. And it is these days no longer a synagogue, but that was the site where I write about that in my book. These guys also went to DeWitt Clinton. On the left, that's Bob Kane, born Robert Kahn, and Bill Finger, who recently we found out had a more Jewish sounding first name. But these were two Bronx kids, and they saw, and DC Comics saw how popular Superman was, and so they were looking for anything that would be the next big thing. And so Kane was a cartoonist. He ran and he came up to the office and found out what was going on and said, I got to get in on that action. And his friend, Bill Finger, who until recently was not really officially acknowledged as the co-creator of Batman. It's only recently, and of course this is Batman. Batman is a darker view of the city, a darker view of the world. It's if Superman and Action Comics, despite its many overtones of World War II and Nazism and Holocaust, is a little brighter vision, Batman is a darker vision. Gotham City is a post-Kristallnacht place. It's a dangerous place. And by the way, I'm not I'm certainly not saying that these Jewish kids who created these characters purposely put in Jewish content. It was probably the opposite of what they wanted to do. They wanted to make something that was all American, that would have an endless audience. But given their backgrounds and their interests and who they were and what and where they came from, in retrospect, it's certainly very plausible to me to do these readings of the Jewish subtext of these characters. I'm going to flip a minute to a few years ago. This is the corner of 192nd Street and the Grand Concourse in the Bronx, which is where there's a place called Poe Park. Poe Park is where Bill Finger and Bob Kane would sit and invent Batman stories and Robin stories, and the woman, the blonde woman here in the middle, is Bill Finger's granddaughter. There's a very interesting movie called Batman and Bill, and a guy named Mark Tyler Nobleman did a lot of research and crusading without a cape, but nonetheless, and there's Batman there too. But it was a long struggle to get Finger recognized as the co-creator, because a lot of legal documents have been signed that where Bob Kane, who was maybe not the most, he was not as moralistic as Batman himself, really refused to let him be recognized. But finally, he was recognized, and then the Bronx recognized one of its Jewish comic creators and named a street after him. There's a street named after Stan Lee recently too. Anyway, back to the late 30s, early 40s, Superman, Batman, Captain Marvel, these characters came out, and it was the first wave of superhero popularity. So you had characters like the Flash, created by a Jewish artist named Harry Lambert. The writer was not, but this was part of DC Comics. Wonder Woman, you would say, my joke when I would do this presentation was Wonder Woman, still not Jewish. However, although Linda Carter was not Jewish, Gal Gadot, who was the most recent Wonder Woman, is not just Jewish, but Israeli. And she's really, I think, how most people think of Wonder Woman. Wonder Woman was created by William Moulton Marston, a psychiatrist and very strange, interesting fellow. You can read about him. An artist named Harry Peter, and this is in the guy with the glasses in the middle is an editor named Sheldon Mayer. He was one of the editors who, quote unquote, discovered Superman. And on the right is Max Gaines, who we saw a little while ago, and we'll see Max's son too. Max's son became much more famous and prominent than Max. They're talking over Wonder Woman here. So again, it's hard to make a case for Wonder Woman as Jewish or as a Jewish metaphor, but she's, certainly a very important character with a number, it came out from something called All American Comics, which was Gaines's sister company to DC. And Gaines broke off and formed a company called Educational Comics, or EC Comics. And he would put out picture stories from the Bible. This is from creation to Judah Maccabee. So it covers a lot of ground. And he put out New Testament comics as well. But he broke off. He let himself be bought out. Meanwhile, elsewhere in Manhattan is this gentleman, this prematurely gray guy. This is a guy named Martin Goodman. He was, I think he was born here, but his parents were immigrants. And if he wasn't born here, he came here at a very young age. And he was a publisher of pulps who wanted in, when he saw how popular Superman and Batman were, he wanted in on the action and founded something called Timely Comics, which is now what we know of as, it's called Marvel Comics. So this guy, was famous mostly for being an imitator, but also took risks. And, this was the very first Marvel comic called Marvel Comics. Artwork, that's the Human Torch, if you know that character. It's also where the Submariner debuted. It was the very first comic book, and it looks, if you know the look of the old pulps, this really has the look of it. And that's it's by an artist named Frank Paul, who was a very, he had actually painted that the painting we saw before of the Amazing Tales magazine. So Goodman had his comics packaged by a company called Funnies Inc. But when he saw that it was becoming very popular, he brought in these two guys on the right. The tall one is named Joe Simon. He was a writer, an editor, and artist. The left is Jack Kirby, and I told you we'd hear the name Kirby a lot. Together, they came up with this Captain America comic. This is the first issue of Captain America, published by Timely, later Marvel. Came out, it's dated March of 1941. That means it came out probably in December of 1940, so a year before Pearl Harbor. So here are these two Jewish comic creators, Simon and Kirby. Kirby from the Lower East Side, very famously. Simon from Rochester and Syracuse. Having Captain America punch Hitler in the jaw on the first cover. This is when movie companies were afraid to do anything like this because they didn't want to lose their German audiences. This was very bold and resulted in death threats, bomb threats. Simon and Kirby, their lives were threatened by anonymous phone calls from, claiming to be from the German-American Bund. And this is where Mayor LaGuardia comes in again, ordering police protection for them. So Kirby, the look and feel of these Timely comics, especially the ones done by Simon and Kirby and by Kirby, they had the kind of feel, if you know the oeuvre of John Garfield. Garfield was born Jules Garfinkel, and he was the most prominent non-comedic Jewish character, right? He wasn't Groucho Marx, wisecracking. He was a serious romantic and action lead. And I think this is very much what Kirby modeled himself. And Kirby was born Jacob Kurtzberg. Oddly enough, but I think he felt, that there was still too much prejudice for him to use a fully Jewish name. I think a lot of these people, there was a certain amount of shame involved in doing comics at all. I think they all had different reasons for the ones who changed their names. This is Captain America's Origin by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby from that comic I showed you. And essentially, if you've seen the Captain America movie, he gets his powers from a scientist who's essentially Albert Einstein. He's called Reinstein or Erskine, or he has many different names, but basically it's Albert Einstein. This is Stanley Tucci as Professor Erskine in the Captain America, the First Avenger movie. So the character is well known, as are so many of the things. Captain America, just like DC had their first brand extension was kind of that cartoon. This was the first Marvel movie. It was a serial called The Purple Death that came out in '41, I believe. And there's Chris Evans as Captain America, the one we know. There is Stan Lee. Stan Lee was Martin Goodman's cousin by marriage. It's also related to the comic business, like the garment industry, like a lot of immigrant-owned businesses, was very incestuous. And Stan came in. He'd had a number of other jobs. He was born Stanley Martin Lieber, and went to DeWitt Clinton High School, as I mentioned, and came aboard as an assistant for Simon and Kirby, really just to help erase stray pencil marks and sweep up. But he had ambitions as a writer. And the comics in those days needed to have text pieces to qualify as magazines and periodicals, so they'd have cheaper postage rates. So it was assumed that nobody read these stories. This is the very first thing Stan Lee ever wrote and had published. It was Captain America Foils the Traitor's Revenge. And that illustration is by Jack Kirby. So technically this is the first Stan Lee, Jack Kirby team up. Stan would go on to co-create characters including the Destroyer, Jack Frost, with a guy named Al Jaffe, who I'll get to later, but you may know his name from Mad Magazine. They created something called Ziggy Pig and Silly Seal. So you can see that the company wasn't just superheroes, they were all over the map with different genres and types of comics. And Simon and Kirby left the company. They had a falling out with Martin Goodman over promised royalties, and they went over to DC Comics. But we'll see a little bit about that later. But this left the company without an editor-in-chief, and Stan was promoted to be the editor of the comics. And except for a few years in the army during the war, he was the editor or / editor-in-chief of Marvel, and art director, and the voice and face of Marvel for the next, he was editor for the next 30 years. He was the voice and face of Marvel and really pretty much of comics for the rest of his life till he died in 2018. This young man is named Will Eisner. Eisner was also a graduate of DeWitt Clinton High School, and he was a key figure in the world of comics. I say that not just because I'm a consultant to the Will Eisner Studios, but probably partly. No, Eisner was very important, especially for something called The Spirit, which was a comic book insert. Newspapers are trying to get in on this comic book racket and bonanza. And so they thought, well, what if we packaged a comic book every week? So we'll get this guy Eisner, who's very dependable and has a great track record. And Eisner came up with this character called The Spirit, which I think you can even see that the artwork is head and shoulders above what some of the other, even above the Supermans. There's a lot of energy in the Superman, Batman stuff, but Eisner really, and he always messed around with layout and design. It's very sophisticated in a way that many comic book artists were not, given that many of them were 17, 18, 19 years old. Eisner was one of the first people to refer to comic books as an art form as early as 1941. Even the most famous and the most successful practitioners of the craft thought of it as that, as a stepping stone to what they would do next, and certainly not as art with a capital A. Eisner, and his material was very Jewish and very New York. The Spirit, lived and worked in a city called Central City, but it was really Eisner's New York. He was a product of Brooklyn and the Bronx, and we'll see later on how he circled around to it. And the strip was filled with the Yiddish in-jokes and expressions and New Yorkisms. He has a character named Slim Mazel, which is a not very subtle play on Schlemazel, and as you might say, me chief claim to fame is hard luck. So Slim Mazel here apparently is a leprechaun of some sort, but so that for those who knew their Yiddish, this was a nice inside joke. This is Jules Feiffer, who you may know for being Jules Feiffer. Feiffer, of course, did the famous newspaper strip at the Village Voice and syndicated for years and years called Feiffer, wrote the screenplays to Carnal Knowledge and Popeye and many other movies, has written a ton of children's books. And Feiffer started out his career as an assistant to Eisner. This is him a little later. You can see he's got one of his own strips, but this is young Feiffer, kind of bluffing his way into a job with Eisner, also a product of the Jewish Bronx of the 30s and 40s, and wrote and drew many stories for and with Eisner. This is one of the most famous ones. It's called 10 Minutes. And of course, the premise is, what are 10 minutes in a man's life? Well, of course, the story would not be called 10 Minutes, but it's set in this very recognizable ethnic Jewish Bronx brownstone tenement. Eisner would always do things like play around with putting the logo of the comic on the page. This is a story about this guy down on his luck named Freddie. He's hanging out at the local candy store, which was sort of the heart and soul of the social life of lower middle class Bronx people. And Freddie he's just, spoiler alert, it's only 60 years old or 70 years old, this story. Freddie has inadvertently killed his childhood mentor, the guy who owns the candy store, and is pretending he's helping out, and clearly that does not go well. But Eisner, Pfeiffer would always say that even if he wrote the script, he channeled Eisner. Eisner was the editor, Eisner was the artist. So it's very much an expression of the Jewish Bronx as seen by Pfeiffer and Eisner, and a very film noir kind of story. This brings us to the third of our Harvard, Princeton, Yale. This is the campus of City College, but it was the original headquarters of the High School of Music and Art in New York City. Among those attending the High School of Music and Art were these two very dignified young men. On the left is Al Jaffe, who, to be redundant, grew up to be Al Jaffe of Mad Magazine's Snappy Answers to Stupid Questions and the Mad Fold-In. And on his right is a guy named Wolf Eisenberg, who became Will Elder. What I love about this picture is just, it's a great picture, but it also could be any two smart-ass Jewish New York kids in pretty much any era. The only thing that gives it away is maybe the shape of the milk bottles. Otherwise, it could have been taken, I think, at any time. And they went on to become with this guy, with Harvey Kurtzman. This is not a high school picture of Harvey, but Harvey invented Mad Magazine, and this was the thing they invented, which, again, I would say was not their intention to create Jewish art or Jewish stories, but neither was it their intention to avoid it either. They brought kind of a Groucho Marx, Lenny Bruce kind of smart-ass, wisecracking street kid that slithering blob coming towards us. What is it? It's Melvin. They would have stories called with names like Ganefs, which of course is Yiddish for thieves. If you look at all the detail, this is by Will Elder, who was famous for putting detail in, which he referred to as chicken fat. That was, all that stuff that has nothing to do with the story. There's a cannon, there's a mangy animal of some kind, there's a bottle, there's rifles, there's a bucket, there's a spittoon, it's a million different, there's flies buzzing around. Elder was famous for that, and he and Kurtzman would do things. This was written and laid out by Kurtzman. An artist named Wally Wood did it. But again, everything about this is smart alecky, really smacks of the Jewish streets, including calling the character Reuben, which is a very kind of funny in-joke on Robin. And they had done something called Super Duper Man that almost got them sued. That did get them sued, but they won. That's why they say this story is a lampoon. If you want to spend your dime on cheap, rotten lampoons like this instead of the ever-loving, genuine, real thing, go right ahead, boy. That is the Mad Magazine sensibility. These are, the man on the left is William Gaines. You may recognize the name. He was the son of Max Gaines. Max Gaines died, they say, saving a child's life in a horrible boating accident in the Adirondacks. He wanted to be a high school chemistry teacher. His mother insisted he take over the business of publishing educational comics. That's his partner in crime, editor and writer Al Feldstein. Together, they changed educational comics to entertaining comics. And rather than picture stories from the Bible, they took it in a slightly different direction. They put out the famous horror stories of the 50s, which were brilliantly done by some of the greatest artists of the time. Feldstein and Gaines wrote a lot of them. They were seen by certain people in Congress and elsewhere as being the product of a degenerate Jewish publishing in New York. One of the people who saw it, oddly enough, was a progressive liberal psychiatrist named Frederick Wertham, who was a refugee from Austria, although he came here in the 1920s before the rise of fascism, but he stayed. He opened a virtually free clinic in Harlem for Black children and adults. He testified on the side of the integrationists in Brown versus Board of Education, but he saw popular culture in general and comic books in particular as a corrosive influence and the evidence of a vile capitalistic money-grabbing society. And so although he himself was progressive to a great degree, found himself aligned with censors and literally anti-Semites in a crusade against comics. It made almost everything that EC was doing unpublishable under what was called the Comics Code, which was a self-policing agency that the publishers set up. So Gaines and Feldstein retrenched, and they thought that there would be a market for a hard-hitting comic called Psychoanalysis. Oddly enough, there was not that much of a market for a hard-hitting comic called Psychoanalysis, but you would have to, this is, given that, psychoanalysis was, if not invented, then certainly, perfected or advanced by Freud and other Jewish therapists. This is a kind of Jewish response to crisis was, I know what the kids will love, a comic about psychoanalysis. And the handsome could be Jewish, could be not therapist was a recurring character. I think all the 3 issues that lasted. They tried other things like that in the so-called New Direction. One thing that did come out of the New Direction was a story called Master Race, written by Feldstein, drawn by an artist named Bernard Krigstein. And it was one of the first, if not the first, story to really address the Holocaust in comic book form. It's got kind of a Henry Twist ending. It's about a death camp commandant and a death camp inmate who escape with their lives after the war, and they meet up again in the New York City subway. And I think you can get a sense that this Krigstein, was a cut above. He was in Will Eisner territory in terms of the amount of work and attention he lavished on this story. And this is considered one of the landmarks of comic book art, Jewish or otherwise. But this was sort of one of the high points of the EC New Direction. The main thing to come out of the EC New Direction was this product of the High School of Music and Art graduates, which was Mad Magazine. Mad was published, it started out as a comic book, as we saw, but they transformed it into a black and white magazine that, the rest is literally history. It became the satire magazine with a very kind of Jewish Borscht Belt kind of edge to it. And it was where things like Al Jaffe's Mad Fold-In first appeared. This was, it was an early one, and it imparted what I think had been thought of as a very New York and specifically very Jewish kind of sensibility to humor, and it begat Saturday Night Live and so much else that we take for granted as what American humor is. These gentlemen are the Bronx Science Fiction Club in the 30s. Some of them are out of town. 1939 was the year of the World's Fair, and it was where I will speed things up. I see we're getting. It was when there were two rival science fiction conventions the same summer, because one was more liberal and left-leaning politically than the others, and there was a schism in the science fiction community. The people who we're concerned with here, second from the left, is Julius Schwartz, who will be a very important editor at DC Comics, And all the way on the right is Mort Weisinger, also a very important editor at DC Comics, specifically relating to superheroes. So the superhero waxed and then waned. Now, superhero reached its peak during the war years, kind of petered out in the late 40s, and a revival started in the mid 50s as a TV was encroaching on comics, and people like Wortham were encroaching, and comics were losing their luster and becoming the object of hate from Congress people and parents groups. So they brought the Flash. The Flash, as you've seen, had been a character in what's called the Golden Age in the 40s. He was brought back. And then this guy, the actor whose name I'm blanking on, I apologize, but in a recent Justice League movie, they decided that the Flash was Jewish, which had never been heard before or since. And I don't think the Flash in the TV show was Jewish, but somewhere in there, the Flash in its one of his current incarnations is Jewish. It was the 60s. It was the era of Philip Roth and Saul Bellow and Bernard Malamud and Grace Paley and introspection and memory. Superman, who for the first 10 or 20 years of his existence never really thought much about being the last son of Krypton, suddenly decided that he needed to go back to the old country. And there were a lot of stories about how miserable he was being a lone sole survivor. There's, again, I don't think this is intentional, but the fact that Superman starts suffering survivor's guilt and then takes the city of Kandor, not the same city in upstate New York, but the city of Kandor, and puts it, he takes this memento of the old country, of Poland, in effect, and keeps it in his fortress of solitude, is a thing that I think is only possible for Jewish creators in the post-Holocaust era. Over the years, Superman, there's a story where he goes back in time and tries to save lives in the Warsaw Ghetto, and it, as all time travel stories do, it backfires. The weird thing was the word Jew and Jewish is never mentioned in this story, and DC caught a lot of flack for it, even though their hearts were in the right place, and probably they would have been criticized if they had used the words Jew and Jewish. But this is a story from the 80s. This is another revival of a Golden Age character now in the 50s, which has come to be called the Silver Age, called the Green Lantern, created earlier by Marty Nodell and Bill Finger, the same Bill Finger from Batman, who were Jewish kids. Nodell, I think, was from Chicago, but I show it. It's a revival. A lot of the creators were Jewish, including John Broome and Gil Kane. So much to the extent that they had these characters called the Guardians, who gave Green Lantern his powers, who were modeled on David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel. The Flash and Green Lantern and Wonder Woman, all these characters were a very popular comic called the Justice League of America that led Martin Goodman, to task his editor and cousin Stan Lee, who had survived the worst of the comic book implosions of the 50s. He tasked Stan Lee and/or Jack Kirby a little later. This is Stan in the late 50s. This is Jack in the 70s. He tasked the two of them with coming up with something called Fantastic Four. Up to then, they'd been doing kind of monster stories, cowboy stories. That's where Groot comes from in this story, done by Stan, his brother Larry Lieber, and drawn by Jack Kirby and Dick Ayers. They came up with the Fantastic Four because Goodman had sort of forgotten that Marvel had not put out any superhero comics for years. This is the first, this is 60 years ago. It's the 60th anniversary of the very first modern Marvel comic and the start of everything that's in the movies. Set in a real New York, and the Human Torch, Mr. Fantastic, the Invisible Girl, later Invisible Woman, and there's the Thing, who we will find out, was more Jewish, but only in retrospect. The Fantastic Four, as I said, not only they live in New York, they had all these stories of other characters who were essentially the Inhumans were a group of persecuted, superpowered beings who hid themselves away from humanity because they feared that they would be persecuted because of their special powers. Yancey Street is where the Thing grew up. It was a version of Delancey Street on the Jewish Lower East Side. They fought characters like the Hate Monger, who again, he had H on his cowl, you know. So aside from being like a attack on Ku Klux Klan types groups, Superman also, when he was unmasked, was revealed to be Hitler or one of his doubles. So World War II was the gift that keeps on giving in comic books because it's still being fought in the movies. Spider-Man, you know, in many ways is the archetypal kind of nerdy, nebbishy Jewish kid who gets superpowers. It's never been established what his religion is, although I must admit I edited a story in which he went to church, but you know, I'm sure that can be explained away. However, in the Spider-Verse animated full-length cartoon that came out a couple of years ago, one of the Spider-Man characters, a Peter Parker, is shown. We see a scene of his wedding where he's stepping on a glass. So at least that Spider-Man seems to be Jewish. Captain America was frozen in an iceberg. He got better, came back in the 60s. Really, you know, as a man out of time, which he still is. That's the character's backstory now. Again, suffering from survivor's guilt. Everybody he knows is dead. Everything he loved is gone. I am not lucky enough to forget forever that I was once the man the world called Captain America. The mighty Thor, you would think, well, what could be the possible Jewish connection to the Norse god of thunder? Well, in the early days of the character especially, and in the first Thor movie, if you've seen it, there's this thing where he wants to marry a mortal. And it, you know, is the nurse known as Jane Foster. He's in love with her, and his father, Odin, who here looks pretty much like a Jewish college professor or Hasidic rabbi, really looks like the Lubavitcher Rebbe, except with a horned helmet. This is ongoing, issue after issue of, no, you cannot marry this mortal girl, it's a shanda. And, you know, I don't think that anybody but two Jews could have come up with this story. This is Stan Lee as the scripter, Jack Kirby as the artist. They each went different ways. Stan married a Protestant British woman and had a you know, almost 70-year marriage. Kirby married literally the Jewish girl next door in Brooklyn. So they each had different solutions to that conundrum, but it, you know, like I said, it just went on issue after, it was too, you know, and then finally Odin decided he would grant Jane superpowers. He'd let her convert. So she goes to Asgard, she gets superpowers, and it's a disaster. You know, she gets rid of the power, she doesn't want them, and she gets sent back to Earth, and Odin introduces Thor to a nice Asgardian girl. All right, I will, and this is Chris Hemsworth. Funny he doesn't look Jewish in the movies, as we know. Sergeant Fury and his Howling Commandos, you know, the character Nick Fury, who somehow grew up to be Sam Jackson. They had an adventure in a concentration camp, thanks to Kirby and Lee. Marvel had a character called Sabra at one, they still do, who's an Israeli superhero. The X-Men, you know, who their persecuted mutant metaphor is often seen as a metaphor for the persecution of Jews, have their main enemy is Magneto, who we learn is a concentration camp survivor. It took years and years for Marvel to finally admit that he was actually Jewish. And, you know, and having worked there, I mean, it was a no-win situation. If you say he's Jewish, then you have this basically genocidal, horrific villain being Jewish, but it's sort of hard to say he's not Jewish if he, you know, they played around, was he Roma, was he gay, was he who knows what. But they finally admitted he was Jewish, and in the more recent movies, we see his powers being unleashed at a concentration camp. There's Ian McKellen and Fassbender as Magneto in the various X-Men movies. This is from an X-Men story where Magneto and Kitty Pryde, who was a Jewish, one of the Jewish member of the X-Men, go to the Holocaust Memorial in DC, and even then, Lee, it was the Jews. My nightmare has been that tomorrow it will be mutants. You know, even here, they were playing it on the fence. Kitty Pryde, though, in a story written by Brian Michael Bendis, who's a very Jewish identified writer. I am Jewish, I am a mutant, I want people to know who and what I am. I tell people because, hey, if you're gonna have a problem with it, I'd like to know. This is a famous X-Men story, Days of Future Past, in which is a dystopian future by Chris Claremont, who himself is Jewish on his mother's side. And it's a story about mutants being hunted and hounded. Well, you know, the metaphor for Jews in the Holocaust is pretty clear. That's the Scarlet Witch. She is one of the so-called Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, and she and her brother Pietro are Magneto's children. So by definition, they're Jewish. This is the WandaVision series that was very popular last year on Disney, part of the Marvel juggernaut. Jack Kirby, as you'll hear the term falling out a lot. There's a lot of fallings out in the comic business. We can talk about why that is. Kirby did not like how he was being treated at Marvel by Stan Lee, by Martin Goodman, went over to DC Comics, and there came up with a line that had a lot of Jewish resonance. Kirby was very Jewish identified, as we saw before with Captain America. He put out a comic that he wrote and drew called The Forever People. That seems like a pretty good metaphor just for Jews, the Forever People. More specifically, in a comic called The New Gods, he does a riff on Genesis. The New Gods were formless in image and aimless in deed. Character named Isaiah. So again, they're not directly Jewish, but there's a hell of a lot of Jewish vibe to it. The moving finger having writ. This is from another one of Kirby's story in what was called the Fourth World Saga. You've seen it. I bring this in because of that recent movie, The Eternals. Kirby, after being dissatisfied at Marvel, Kirby was dissatisfied at DC. It's a long story. Came back to Marvel, did something called The Eternals, in which this character called Arishem, who you may recall if you saw the movie, is set up. He's called a celestial. He's set up in judgment over the earth. Does Arishem really mean anything in Hebrew? I don't think, people think Kal-El. Jerry and I were discussing this earlier, whether or not Kal-El, the birth name of Superman, is intentionally evocative of Hebrew. I have my doubts about it, but maybe. This is a character called Arishem. I think one of the most Jewish things in there was the Gods and Men at City College, which was in its day, especially in Kirby's youth, was kind of the home of the Jewish intelligentsia of New York. So this story is not about that, but I think it takes a certain kind of awareness of that heritage from somebody Jewish to even give a story that title. This is the movie, The Eternals. That's Arishem, or one of the Celestials in the background. Maybe you've seen it. We can discuss it. This is the Fantastic Four character, The Thing, in a Hanukkah card that Kirby made for his friends and family. People took it as proof that Kirby intended The Thing to be Jewish. I don't particularly buy it, but it's canon now. The Thing has had an adult bar mitzvah. He got married and, like Peter Parker, stepped on the glass and then had this famous dialogue with a villain he has just captured. You're really Jewish? Is there a problem with that? No, it's just you don't look Jewish. I'm not even sure the people who did this particular story were Jewish. This is the Arrow show on the WB, which had a specifically Jewish character named, wait, I've written it down, named Felicity Smoke, S-M-O-A-K, played by Emily Beth Rickfords. She's lighting Hanukkah candles. So certainly we've gone beyond the metaphorical level. This is the Golem character. There are those who think Superman is a Golem character. But Marvel at one point had its own Golem character. A guy named James Sturm did a graphic novel about barnstorming golems, don't ask, called The Golem's Mighty Swing. The Shallow Man by Al Wiesner, was a independently published Jewish comic. Alan Irish put out his Jewish Hero Corps that had characters including Matzah Woman. Robert Crumb, who was not Jewish, but certainly is Jewish identified, had an underground comic in the 70s featuring Lenore Goldberg and her Girl Commandos. It's Crumb, either you love it or hate it. He did do a fully illustrated book of Genesis about 10 years ago. The first book of the Bible graphically depicted, nothing left out. And in that story, I suppose because one of Noah's sons is named Shem, he thought it was close enough to Shem that he drew Moses' sons looking like the Three Stooges. This is a guy named Harvey Pekar who rose to fame working with Crumb on stories, many of which had a great deal of Jewish content, and certainly none more so than standing behind old Jewish ladies in supermarket lines. If you've seen the American Splendor movie, you might have seen Paul Giamatti as Harvey Pekar acting this out. That's Paul Giamatti in the movie. This is Will Eisner many years later. Eisner left the world of comics. He kept doing comics, which he called sequential art, instructional manuals for corporations and for the military. But when he realized there would be an audience, the underground comics convinced him there would be an audience for more sophisticated comic stories. It didn't have to be superheroes. Not that there's anything wrong with superheroes, but Eisner didn't invent the term graphic novel, but he certainly put it on the map in his 1978 A Contract with God, which are stories based on Jewish life in the Bronx of the 1930s, which is more or less what he devoted the rest of he died in 2005, and he put out a graphic novel a year, most of them dealing with Jewish life in America in the 30s, 40s, 50s. This is Cook Lane, another one of the stories in Contract with God. Cook Lane is a name for a kind of resort in the Catskills where you did your own cooking. The very last thing Eisner finished just before he died was a graphic novel called The Plot, exposing the so-called protocols of the Elders of Zion as a fraud in graphic novel form. Eisner inspired people like Art Spiegelman, who famously did the Pulitzer Prize-winning Mouse, about his father's experiences in Auschwitz. Some other graphic novels with Jewish content. Joe Kubert, famous for Sergeant Rock, if you remember that, did a graphic novel called Yussel, imagining what his life would have been like had his family not come to America. He did a graphic novel called Jew Gangster, which is about, it's also autobiographical, dealing with his parents constantly telling him, you don't want to grow up to be a Jew gangster like those hoodlums you're hanging around with. Terrific graphic novel called The Property by Rutu Modan, about a grandmother and grandchild who go back to Poland, considering reclaiming their property that was stolen during the Holocaust. There's a book called We Spoke Out by Neil Adams, Raphael Madoff, and Craig Yo, that deals with war stories from American comics dealing with the Holocaust. This was the novel, The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay by Michael Chabon, that came out about 20 years ago, that's kind of based on Siegel and Schuster and other comic book creators. Jules Feiffer, at age 92, is still going strong, put out a trilogy of graphic novels. This one is about really Jews in New York and in show business and in politics. This is a trilogy, so this is the third volume called The Ghost Script. I recommend it. This is my book, Disguised as Clark Kent. This is A Marvelous Life, the Stan Lee book. This is Where to Find Me. And have I left any time for questions? So that is kind of a, in 25 words or more, the story of Jews and superheroes in comics. Oh. Okay, So I'm ready for any questions that,
Jerry, you want to try?
where did Jerry go?
Other Jerry.
No, I know.
Um, I didn't see very much in the chat box. People were saying that they were from all over the place. Well, one question. I guess I'll do it. I don't know what Jerry is now. The other
Okay.
Jerry. One question was, well, from Mindy. Mindy says she doesn't want to ask questions. You want to ask your question yourself, Mindy? You want me to ask it? Well, her question was, were girls as great fans of comic books as guys? And what did women do in making the comics and designing them?
You know, this is, I think comic books, I think were pretty equally read by girls and boys, you know, in the 30s, 40s, 50s. I think in the 60s, it might have shifted to be a more guy-oriented thing, kind of like a, you know, that's not a good thing, but I think it sort of became a literal and figurative boys club. Lily Renee, as Michael Dooley is kind enough to point out, she is 100, as is Al Jaffe, actually. So I'm trying to arrange, you know, they're both, you know, for all I know, Lily Renee's husband is alive. I have no idea if she's available, but I was thinking maybe I could get her together with Al. Lily Renee was an important artist, and I need to actually incorporate her into this into this presentation. She came to America on the Kindertransport, and she didn't do superhero work specifically. She did action adventure stuff, and she was one of the only female artists doing heroic stuff. I think that women, the few women that were in the business, did a lot of humor comics and romance comics. So even stuff like Archie was done largely by men. So I would say, but yeah, Lily Renee is an important person that I should put into this presentation. In the 60s, there were artists. Marie Severin was an important artist at Marvel. She both doing superhero adventure and a lot of humor stuff. She was the artist of one of the sister of one of the Mad artists, a guy named John Severin, who was one of those DeWitt Clinton, one of those music and art alumni. So they were New York, but not Jewish. Michael, anybody else I'm forgetting besides?
Okay, well, how about Danny?
Yeah.
Another question from the Jerry who can't use his phone is, who is actually reading? You know, various Jewish young men were designing and writing it. Who was actually reading all this stuff?
Everybody. I mean, you know, I'd say the general, mostly children, but a lot of GIs. A lot of comics were sent and sold in PXs and army bases. You know, they were considered literally disposable entertainment. But yeah, I think it was I think everybody read them. Not, you know, not so many adults, but more adults than you'd think. But I think it was, you know, I think they were, you know, they were found in newsstands, and there were newsstands everywhere, and candy stores and drugstores. There was no internet, there was no television. There was, you know, one thing that I kind of always, you know, kind of had to, you know, since I had to narrow it down to 140 slides. I mean, you know, that's why I wrote a book. I mean, it's always easy to forget radio. You know, radio was so important in entertainment and information in a different way than it is today. I mean, there were, you know, a lot of the EC comics, I think, were riffing on the suspense and detective radio shows of the era. But they were, I think there was a period they were read by all children for a few years, right? You know, it was, you know, I should keep a scorecard, because it's, even today, shorthand in movies or TV shows even though comics, even though with Will Eisner and Jules Feiffer and Art Spiegelman kind of blazing the trail for comics as an art form, still, if you want to show in a movie that somebody's an idiot, you have them reading a comic book. I mean, it's just, it's, you know, and somewhere, even as we speak, someone is fashioning a headline that says, "Pow, bam, zap, comics aren't just for kids anymore," and thinking they're very clever, you know, even though that's a, I mean, you know, even though it's a headline that, you know, has been seen a million times.
Well, I was surprised when I was a kid that about Wonder Woman. You know, she was a great character, and I loved her. You know, and until Wonder Woman came, and I thought all these superheroes were men, and yet, you know, she was fine. You know.
There were a few. I mean, they were mostly men, but there were Wonder Woman, a lot of the Marvel, the Captain, you know, kind of. I feel like sort of have left Captain Marvel out, and that was such a popular character in the 40s and 50s till they were sued out of existence by Superman, you know. But that I think I've left it out is because I couldn't find a real Jewish connection, except one of the editors, a guy named Will Lieberson, uh, you know, was the only real Jewish connection I could find to Captain Marvel. So, you know, again, this history is so rich. There's so much of it. I mean, you know, I mean, just I can see by the, you know, by the comments that people are aware of stuff that I've left out. And again, some of it is just because in an hour there's only so much you can get in. Ron Zoni asked if the newspaper strips, you know, I guess the most famous newspaper, successful Jewish newspaper cartoonist was Al Capp, who's a mixed bag himself, as he was not exactly the most lovely person either. But for the most part, this was similar to advertising in that it was sort of this unspoken thing that it was kind of this elite. I don't know if quite waspy. There seemed to be a lot of Irish cartoonists, you know, but it definitely was a, you know, no, you know, keep out, no XYZ need apply. You know, it was, you know, and that was one reason the people, you know, it for these kids, you know, and I know it's kind of funny to think of Al Jaffe or Stan Lee as kids or Jack Kirby, but for these kids, when they broke in, the thing they aspired to was to be a syndicated cartoonist, because there was syndicated cartoonists were earned like and were treated like rock stars. If you were doing Dick Tracy or you were doing Little Orphan Annie or Little Abner or any, you know, I mean, I guess the most famous is Charles Schultz with Peanuts, but that was really the upper echelons, both in prestige, right? The people, you'd see them on radio programs and TV shows and being interviewed by mainstream newspapers. That was somehow considered more respectable than comic books, which were, you know, published by the same publishers that put out porn. You know?
How about, you know, you talk about superheroes and the elitists and stuff, but I remember when I was a kid, there, especially in the Captain Marvel stuff, there were these real funny characters. I mean, like, you know, animals that talked and you know, real funny, rather than superheroes and the funnies. I mean, how much of that was there?
Well, I mean, look, there's a certain, even the most quote unquote serious cartooning has a certain humorous look to it. You know, I mean, there's just something about cartooning that's a step removed from reality. But you know, Captain Marvel really made a point of having this whimsical side, and it was very tongue in cheek. You know, I think as years went on, and comics were attacked and marginalized, I think there was almost this, you know, this need, this obsession with being taken seriously. I think, you know, sort of the nadir. You know, everybody, including me, remembers the Batman TV show fondly, but for a lot of people, that it took such a frivolous attitude towards the characters that really infect. You know, I mean, one of the reasons you don't see these kind of quote unquote serious movies till maybe Batman in 1989 is that nobody took it seriously. There there were just generations of Hollywood executives and producers and directors who thought the only way to approach comics was as a spoof. And I think sort of as a reaction to it, look, the Marvel comics were famous for their humor. Stan and Jack and even Steve Ditko, who was the co-creator of Spider-Man, had a lot of funny stuff. But I think there was this feeling that if they didn't take it seriously, then they were just opening the floodgates to being marginalized again. And how and it took it's the famous story where like Stan is pitching Spider-Man to a studio, and the guy he's pitching to says, "Does it have to be a spider?" So it's sort of there's this sort of this history of people not getting what made the things tick. But you're right. There is, I think there's been a humorous comics. We're in this. If you haven't been to a comic shop ever or for years, I mean, it's pretty the variety of comic books and graphic novels and sequential art and whatever you want to call it. The variety of stuff outside superheroes is mind-boggling. Many of the people doing these things have day jobs and can't support themselves doing it. But and with the internet, that's a world that I'm only barely scratching the surface of. Comics has always been this very democratic medium where all you needed was a pencil and a piece of paper. Now, getting it published and getting it distributed is a whole other story. But if you just want to express yourself in comic book format, then literally, it's, children can do it. So it's a very, that's the good and bad news, I guess. But you're right. There were, and especially Captain Marvel and the Marvel family, which has nothing to do with Marvel Comics, confusingly enough, was a much stronger subgenre.
But how about the opposite side now? I mean, you talk about the real funny comics. I remember when I was a kid, they had these so-called comic books about World War III and about the country being destroyed and atomic bombs and all kinds of
Right.
horrible things. Nothing about that was mentioned. I don't know if Jewish people were involved with that or not, but,
Yeah,
but that was sort of a scary type of thing.
These are a lot of these were put out. Sort of the best of them were put out by Julie Schwartz and a guy named Jack Schiff, who was Jewish at DC. The things that Marvel timely, the big surprise about Marvel was they were known for putting out schlock. The ones you're probably remembering were from DC, and they very much were a product of their times and about the fear of nuclear holocaust and humans doing ourselves in, and about space, about the race for space and the Cold War. There was a group called the Atomic Knights that the premise was they lived in a post-apocalyptic, post-nuclear apocalyptic America. Ron Zoni has a question. When I say that Stan, I think what Stan and Jack did, was introduce a New York, quote unquote, neurotic sensibility to comic books. Well, that was sort of part of the quote unquote realism. If you can look at those comics and without fighting Doctor Doom or fighting the Hulk, and see it, call them realistic. Marvel introduced realism and I think amplified what DC, what EC and Mad have been doing with the Yiddishisms and the New Yorkisms, and Stan really ratcheted it up. Again, trying to appeal to a general audience, but not being afraid to give the characters a certain kind of New York sensibility. One of my favorite Stan Lee stories is artist named Jim Mooney tells this story. Stan liked to walk. He would go out on his lunch hour with, instead of having a lunch meeting, he would go out for a walk. He just walked all over New York. He was sort of the quintessential New Yorker who just walked for miles and miles and hours and hours. So one day he's out with Jim Mooney, and Stan has a brand new suit on that he's very proud of. Stan was kind of a clothes horse and very stylish, and they're walking along, and a pigeon craps on the suit, and just ruins the suit. And Stan looks up at the pigeon flying away and shakes his fist, and he says, "For the Goyim, you sing." Mooney, that sort of, that to me, that's kind of, Stan was, he was so Jewish he didn't know it. He came out of this publishing business that was really kind of a step sibling to the garment business. The comics were often published out of, like, in a back room of a schmatter company, but his milieu was so Jewish. I mean, the two places Stan lived were New York City, or the three places: New York City, Long Island, and Hollywood. Well, I mean, I think his world was so Jewish that I don't even know if he realized it. He married a Gentile woman. He had a big tragedy. He had two children, one of whom died in infancy, and I think that Jewish background that he and Kirby had, and a lot of the creators had, you kind of mix that in with various personal tragedies in Stan's life. I think he was a great, and you can't do it without Kirby. It's a visual medium. Kirby was a great storyteller. Kirby plotted a lot of the, they had this collaboration, which led to a lot of these fallings out that I mentioned, and lawsuits and all this other stuff. But I think together they were a conduit for this kind of reportage of the human condition, through kind of a Jewish kind of lens that I just think was unique in the medium. And look where it's, I think that the movies and TV shows today are still running on that sensibility. Even if nobody specifically involved in a particular movie or show is Jewish, I think it's just this real, what Jews do best in media, which is kind of reflect back the culture with insight to people who kind of are living it without thinking about it. I think that's I don't know if calling it Talmudic or midrashic is too much, but there's something about it that's that I think is Jewish in some way that I've tried to articulate, but in some ways is, dare I say, ineffable.
Well, Danny, thank you very much. I would say we run out of time. We ran out of time 10 minutes ago.
Well, thank everybody who stuck around. So I didn't get to read from the book. You'll just have to read it on your own. Get it from the library if you like. But as I said, if you enjoyed me talking, there's an audio book that I read for it too. So 14 hours of this in your ear. Who could pass that up?
Well, thank you very much, Danny. This whole thing, it has been recorded. I will edit out the beginning where we, before we actually started, right. And I'll post it and I'll send everyone an email. And in the email, there'll be some references to some of your books so people can buy whatever they feel like it.
Thank you so much. Thanks, and thanks Ronzoni for hooking me up with Jerry and the whole group. And I thank you all for your time and attention.
And thank you very much. And also thank Ron and other people. If you have ideas of things you want to teach, or a friend like Danny who could teach something that you think would be interesting, give us an email. Where our motto is come learn with us. We don't want to be separate. We want to all be together. So we enjoyed that. And I'd like to also, besides Danny, I want to thank Bracha and Diane, who are helping to be like what we call tech showmers. And Jerry Stilkin, even though he had voice computer problems, he gave me a few questions to ask. And Mindy, who said she knows nothing about the comics, but she had some questions also. And also on Sunday, this coming Sunday, we're having a talk from Israel about the kibbutzim, about how the kibbutzim have changed over the years. So that'll be at 1 o'clock on Sunday. Again, all our classes are free. Donate as much as you want. So thank you very much. I'm sorry we went over time, but it was very interesting talk.
Thank you. This was great fun. Thanks a lot, everybody. Thank you, Jerry.
Thanks.
Take care. Okay. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.